For anybody who's joining us who is not a member or affiliate of Queen Anne Lutheran, I'm Pastor Dan Peterson. I am in my almost 5th year of ministry at Queen Anne Lutheran. Very happy with the way things are going there, and kind of strange to think that it's been almost 5 years, but here we are. The video today, as you know, will be recorded. You will be able to watch this video if you wish on our YouTube channel, which is easy to access. Just type in Queen Anne Lutheran if you don't subscribe already in YouTube, and you'll be able to find it. In terms of questions, you probably noticed that our speakers have different preferences. In my case, we are covering at least 4 sessions in one today, so that will mean we're going to go at a rapid pace. Because of that, while I certainly absolutely welcome clarifying questions as we go, and while I give you time in this forum to reflect on the topic at the end, I would like us to move as quickly as we can so we can cover this material. How does that work? Well, if you have a question for clarification, because I can't see all of your faces, especially those who are calling in by phone, if you could just ask the question as I go, that would be totally fine with me. Beyond that, if you have additional comments, you're welcome to share them in the chat field, and I'll have a question for you at the beginning that will focus on that specifically. We have 1 hour to cover this, about 57 minutes now. By the end of today's discussion, you will know where the term demonic comes from. You will know how it influenced various New Testament authors. You will know how Martin Luther appropriated and in some ways changed the focus when it comes to the role of evil and the Christian understanding of the devil, and in fact, from Luther's perspective, the necessity of the devil for Christian faith. Then at the end, we'll be looking at Paul Tillich, a theologian of the 20th century, who is one of the only 20th century theologians to write extensively on the demonic. We're going to look briefly at how his experience as a German living during the time of National Socialism and the rise of Hitler shaped and formed his understanding of the demonic, an understanding that we might wish to consider when it comes to talking about the demonic today. I will also, if we have time, make a few contemporary connections so that we can update this language as best as possible. So, without further ado, let me begin. Over the past couple weeks, we have been talking about the demonic from the perspective of 2 distinct religious traditions, obviously Judaism and Roman Catholicism. Probably all of us have a number of takeaways, things we've been thinking about, particularly since last week. We had quite a discussion, quite a presentation on the demonic from a Catholic perspective. I have several takeaways as well, and I wanted to share those with you by way of introduction here. First, the language of the demonic, while present in Judaism, is not nearly as significant or central in Judaism as it is in Christianity. And here's why. God, as Dr. Lawrence shared with us from a Jewish perspective, is the one who is ultimately responsible for everything. So if we have a problem, we take it up with God. Now, who takes it up with God in the Jewish faith? Well, first answer, everybody. Second answer, the prophets of old, the Hebrew prophets. They don't talk about how, for example, Paul talks when it comes to receiving a messenger from Satan, the thorn in the side of his flesh. He says that in 2 Corinthians. That could be a reference to a physical ailment like malaria or epilepsy. It could also be, I've always found this interpretation amusing, a member of the Corinthian community who is particularly irksome to Paul. But you don't find that in the Hebrew prophets. What you find instead are people of faith who take it up with God, because God is the one who is ultimately responsible. A great illustration of that is in the book of Job. According to the book of Job, God and one of the members of God's heavenly court have a bet. There's a wager that's placed. And what happens is that God allows the wager to move forward. God allows Satan to inflict God's servant Job. So that at the very end, in the epilogue, which was written most likely well after the story itself had first been put down, we hear that God is the one responsible. So in that case, you have another example. Job doesn't blame the evil in his life on demons. He doesn't blame it on even Satan. He blames it, or at least comes to God with it. And that's where the focus of the dialogue is for the latter half of the narrative. So in all of those cases, because God is the one ultimately responsible, when you have a problem, when you experience suffering, you take it up with God. And if you don't believe me, read basically every single psalm in the Old Testament, if not certain books in general. This is also true for post-Holocaust protest theodicy. Now that's a mouthful. The word theodicy comes to us from a philosopher named Leibniz several centuries back. It means the justification of God in the face of evil and suffering. The justification of God in the face of evil and suffering. And what you have in protest theodicy from a Jewish perspective after the Second World War is rarely, if ever, any mention of evil apart from its ultimate source in God. So protest theodicy spokespeople, again, take their case up with God. They don't blame demons. They don't blame evil spirits. Ultimately, they put this at the feet, as it were, of God. And so the theodicy in question is about that relationship. You may recall several weeks ago hearing about Elie Wiesel, who in the early 1990s wrote an op-ed to the New York Times. This is so fascinating, saying that he had finally given up arguing with God, that he wanted a truce. But notice here again how the focus is between the individual and God, not between the individual and God's intermediaries or lesser spirits. So that's my takeaway from Judaism. Roman Catholicism, on the other hand, affirms the existence of evil spirits capable of possessing human beings in a way that is held by the official teaching or the official hierarchy of the church even today. So Roman Catholicism is much more comfortable talking about evil spirits. That's not to say this wasn't language you find in Judaism, but Beatrice pointed out that by the time you get to the European Enlightenment and the age of science, once we had a medical perspective to explain things like achy limbs or joints instead of demons, that kind of language was largely abandoned in the Jewish faith. Roman Catholicism, on the other hand, has continued to preserve that language as part of its official teaching, so much so that every diocese, which is to say in Lutheran language, every synod has a trained exorcist. And priests are taught about this kind of thing in seminary. Lutheran pastors, at least at the seminary I attended, and I would assume all other ELCA seminaries, are not taught these things. So if you need an exorcism, don't come to me. Please don't come to me for this. If you do, I may be in the process of exercising myself, so please don't come to me for this. It's just not something we're trained to do. And what I'm going to show you today is why that is the case. There's actually, I think, a precedent here in Luther himself. So what I want to do today then is, having outlined briefly those two opposing perspectives, or at least contrasting perspectives, is sketch a third way, a middle way that affirms the reality of the demonic while recognizing the talk of demons and evil spirits to be fundamentally mythological or symbolic in nature. So I'm interested in carving out this third way. And I wrote this in the margins of my notes. Cool, exclamation point, not my original intention. I had no idea where we would be by the end of this series. Now I know. And what I want to do is carve out, I guess today, what I would call a Lutheran way that looks at the origin of the term demonic, looks then at its development in New Testament writings, looks then at how it's appropriated by Martin Luther, and then finally how it's updated by Paul Tillich in the 20th century. But before we start our presentation, I want to frame the conversation for each of you with this question. Based on our discussion so far in this series, do you find the language of demons, the demonic, evil or evil spirits illuminating or useful? If yes, why? If no, why? If yes and no, why? I'd like you to think about that for yourselves. You may wish to jot a few notes down on a piece of paper. You are also absolutely welcome to share your thoughts in the chat field as we go. But that's my question to you, and we'll come back to it at the end of today's presentation. Based on our discussion so far in this series, do you find the language of demons, the demonic, evil or evil spirits illuminating or useful? All right, let's talk about the term demonic and how it plays out in the New Testament. What I want to do to get at the New Testament is look at Jewish and Greek influences. And I'm using an article. You'll see this as we go. I tried to cite my sources as best as possible. An article by Walter Sundberg called The Demonic in Christian Thought. It was absolutely outstanding. I don't particularly agree with his theological perspective, but I love his analysis of the demonic. According to Sundberg, Greek myth is what introduces the language. And the word here is daimon, which is D-A-E-M-O-N. And daimon simply in the Greek language means an anonymous god. An anonymous god. The word is personified, in other words, to point to vague powers of fate which were believed to bring about events. So the vague powers of fate, as understood by the Greek mind, this word was used to point to those. It simply means, again, anonymous God who is responsible for causing a particular episode of fate. All right. The word demon was used at the time to point to generic deities which human beings use to personify fate and assuage it through worship. So what I want to point out here at the beginning is just this. The term is neutral before the New Testament period. The term is neutral before the New Testament period. And even in the New Testament, we have traces of this neutral understanding. I'll give you one quick example. It's in Acts chapter 17, verse 18, where Paul's interlocutors ask if he is representing foreign divinities. So foreign divinities is you might say a leftover from this older understanding of daimon. Some of you know this from reading Plato and his accounts of Shakespeare. That's right, Shakespeare lived in the ancient Greek world. His accounts of Socrates. Socrates consults the daimon for insight, the oracle for knowledge. The term itself does not have a negative meaning. It simply means anonymous God, or when it is used on occasion in the New Testament, foreign divinities. I like that. It's a neutral term. The dominant meaning, however, of the demonic by the time we get to the New Testament is evil. And not just evil, but evil spirits. The word daimonium, which is plural for demonic, means evil spirits, usually connected to a chief demon. Can anybody guess who that chief might be?
Beelzebub?
Beelzebub is a great example. Yeah, so in the Gospel of Matthew, Beelzebub is used as the chief of the demons. This goes all the way back to the Old Testament. The word Beelzebub, I preached on this a couple months ago, comes from the Canaanite name for its god, Baal. So it was Beelzebub is actually the proper pronunciation. The storm god, the Canaanite deity of storms. You actually see some lingering presence of this storm god in a couple places in the Old Testament. If you're curious, you can read Psalm 18. There's an example of that. So yes, absolutely. Beelzebub or Beelzebub, the Lord of the skies. The view in the book of First Kings and changed it to Beelzebul, which means insect or fly. So the Lord of the skies became the Lord of the flies in the Hebrew Bible. It's fascinating. Another name for this chief of demons is Belial, and then also, of course, Satan himself, the father of lies, according to the Gospel of John. So what we're talking about here are legions of demons who are ruled by a particular leader of the demons, Satan, Beelzebub, or Belial. Examples of this abound in New Testament literature. You have in our gospel reading for today, for example, John 12, reference to the ruler of this world, which is not Joe Biden or a couple months ago, Donald Trump, opinions to the contrary notwithstanding. The ruler of this world is a reference to Satan. So a reference to Satan as the ruler of this world. And last month in our second reading, we heard from Paul in 2 Corinthians a reference to the God of this world, who has blinded the minds of unbelievers. So this language appears throughout the New Testament. Language of a God of this world, the God of the belly, the ruler of this world, the father of lies. These are all references to an evil spirit in charge of other evil spirit. And this reflects, broadly speaking, the apocalyptic mindset that Christianity retained over the subsequent centuries and Judaism largely abandoned. What mindset is that? God as ruler has been temporarily displaced by Satan and various demons, or Satan rather, as the ruler of this world. So God has been temporarily displaced by the ruler of this world. This is only for a short time. In nerd speak, we call this interim dualism. The idea that you have two opposing powers for a brief period, which of course will finally come to its resolution when God, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians, will once again be all in all. So why do bad things happen to good people? Well, if you go back to the Hebrew Bible, one answer is because you're bad, because you did bad things. Therefore you suffer. And if you are righteous, you would prosper. Now that view, thanks be to God, is called into question by later Old Testament authors, including the book of Job, but it's there. In the New Testament, Jesus questions that directly in Matthew 5. He points out how God sends sunshine and rain to the righteous and wicked alike. But also you have reference here to Satan. So why do bad things happen to good people? Well, to quote the church lady from Saturday Night Live, I don't know, could it be Satan? Yes. So if you go to the Gospel of Luke, there is a story of a woman who was kept in captivity by Satan for 18 years until Jesus releases her from her ailment. So the relatively common view during the time of Jesus in the first century was this apocalyptic mindset whereby God's rule has been temporarily displaced such that Satan, the ruler of this world, is in charge and is the source of our various ailments and problems. Okay, what I want to show you now is the second slide, and that is this. How did this happen? Where did this view come from? The Greeks had one understanding of daimon, which simply means, again, anonymous God, or in the New Testament, as it was appropriated, foreign divinities. But otherwise, there's a sharp difference. One where you move from a neutral understanding of a term to its purely negative understanding? How do we get, in other words, from anonymous God to evil spirits in the New Testament? Well, this is where I find a little background going back a couple centuries helpful. This comes from Walter Sundberg in his article I mentioned, The Demonic in Christian Thought. He says, reflection on the battle of the divine and the demonic becomes characteristic of theology in the exile and post-exilic periods. In other words, when the Jews were taken into captivity by the Babylonians for 50 years, from about 587 or 586 BCE to 536 BCE. So you have 50 years of exile, and that experience, understandably, informs the Jewish perspective. My confirmation students yesterday, we were talking about how these ideas develop in the Bible. And my point to them, with reference to Rob Bell, is this: the Bible didn't fall leather bound from the sky. These perspectives take time, indeed centuries, to develop. And the perspective we're talking about here on evil is certainly no exception to that. So the reflection on the battle of the divine and the demonic becomes characteristic of theology in the exile and post-exilic periods. Why? Because during this period, the Israelites were exposed to the religion of the Babylonians, which goes by the names, what is it? It's Zarathustra as the prophet. It's Zoroastrianism. So Zoroastrianism teaches not that God is one, but that there are two principles or gods that are opposed to each other in this universe, the God of good and the God of evil. And that mindset, scholars will argue, had an influence on the Jews who were living in the context of Babylon and their understanding of the gods for 50 years. So it makes sense that they would adopt some of their perspective. This reflection can be floridly apocalyptic. This is not surprising given the fact that the subject matter has to do with the nebulous fringes of history. So we're talking here about evil and sin in its radical dimensions. So it lives kind of on the outskirts or the edges of history. Gradually, this reflection centers on the dramatic myth of Satan. Intertestamental literature, which runs roughly from about 200 BC to the 1st century, intertestamental literature is particularly important in this regard. As this tradition develops, Satan, specifically in the figure of the serpent in the Garden of Eden, the consorting of the sons of God with the daughters of men in Genesis 6, and the angelic rebel cast out of the heavens, and that's in Isaiah. So let me come back to our discussion now for a second. Let's see if we can unpack that. Is Satan mentioned in the book of Genesis? No, not by name. What we have there is the serpent. In fact, as my confirmation students and I discovered, there are tons of things that aren't there in the original creation story. There is no reference, for example, to the apple from the tree. For one thing, that wasn't a fruit that people of the period would have eaten. It might have been the apricot of the tree if we wanted to be geographically accurate. The apple from the tree is an interpretation that we have thanks to Renaissance artists who were of the North and who assumed that the fruit of the tree must be an apple. The same thing is true of Satan. He's never mentioned by name in the book of Genesis. He's never mentioned by name in Genesis 2 and 3. What we have there is the serpent, not Satan. He's never mentioned by name when it comes to the sons of God mating with the daughters of men, according to Genesis 6. And he's never mentioned as the one who falls from the sky, according to Isaiah. These are later interpretations on the other side of this development of which I'm speaking. That doesn't necessarily mean, for example, that the serpent isn't an agent of evil, but we want to be clear that contextually, the understanding of Satan has developed, which is why when we go back to these texts, it shouldn't be surprising, after all, that the word Satan isn't there. It's because that language, that theology was not being used at the time. Interesting, huh? All right, questions about that? You see where we're going with this? Okay, great. So we have in the development here, thanks perhaps to the exposure in part to the Persian or Zoroastrian religion, we have an explanation for why this language of evil spirits associated with daimon became prevalent during the intertestamental and subsequent New Testament periods. So I think that's really helpful. So let's step back for a second and see what we've covered. We've talked about how originally the term daimon in Greek was simply neutral. It meant anonymous God or deities who were called upon to appease anonymous God. So what you have here is an understanding of daimon as anonymous God or foreign divinities, a neutral expression. By the time you get to the New Testament, however, daimon becomes evil spirit for the most part, and these evil spirits have a leader, and that leader is, of course, Satan or Beelzebub. The reason for that transition, among other things, I think would have been twofold. Number one, the exposure to a religion in Babylon that observed a kind of religious or metaphysical dualism, where you have two deities opposed to one another, the God of the good and the God of evil. But then also that the experience of massive suffering and persecution on the part of the Jews. I think what you have is a realization that the language they were using was not necessarily adequate to the task, such that even though you don't have this language of the demonic developed in the Old Testament, you can see its rumblings begin there, the struggle between demonic powers that will finally find explicit expression in the subsequent intertestamental and New Testament periods to follow. Wow, and I haven't even been drinking coffee yet. All right, any questions? So far, so good. Nancy, I see you've got your coffee cup. Okay, let's turn to Martin Luther. Now, are we all on the, we're not on screen share, are we? No? Okay, all right. So Martin Luther, 1600 years later, where do you think people stood at this point in Christian Europe on the topic of evil spirits? Do you think much had changed? Yes or no? I need a spot on this one. Yes or no?
No.
No. No is yes. Yeah. No is correct. Yeah. So evil spirits were still believed in by the general population. There are all kinds of stories around Martin Luther in this regard. I'm going to share with you one that's fascinating. But when Luther died, for example, Catholic opposition maintained that all the evil spirits that were inside of him flew out of his mouth. We'll see if that's true of me, but in the case of Martin Luther, this was part of the Counter-Reformation to argue that Luther himself was demonically possessed. Of course, Luther in this regard was no exception. At the beginning of our pandemic, almost a year ago now, if not more than a year ago now, I mentioned a treatise that Martin Luther wrote in 1527 called Whether One May Flee from a Deadly Plague. You'll have to forgive me for this, but the question he was asking was to flee or not to flee. And so in this case, you have a treatise that was written that talks openly about how evil spirits could be responsible for spreading, and the devil himself induces fear and cowardice in the face of the plague. Now, what I love about this particular writing and this experience that Luther has, and I've mentioned this before, scholars tell us he survived, I believe, 3 outbreaks of the plague during his lifetime. And it's possible that during this outbreak in 1527, that Martin Luther wrote "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God," which I think is incredible testimony to Luther's faith in the face of such a horrific event like this, that he could write such a hymn during this time. He survived those 3 outbreaks, obviously, and did so, I think, with tremendous courage, tending along with his wife, Katie Luther, to victims of the plague. So in this regard, Martin Luther simply follows his predecessors. He believed, at least to some degree, that evil spirits were responsible for the spread of that was simply part of Luther's worldview. However, Luther also departs from his predecessor in three ways, and I want to point those out now. The first is sorry, was there a question? Okay. The first was his departure in terms of, let me step back and try that again. Luther didn't just speak of the evil as supernatural spirits. He also used the language of the demonic or of the Antichrist to define a political reality that he was criticizing. And the best example of that, of course, was the power of the papacy. According to Heiko Obermann, and I'll be citing him for the next few minutes, he wrote this wonderful book I read in seminary called Luther, Man Between God and the Devil. And what Obermann points out is that when the sovereignty in heaven and service on earth are exchanged, when they're exchanged or interchanged, all hell breaks loose. And the vicar of Christ, the one who is tasked to be the servant of Christ, the Pope in Rome, is transformed into the Antichrist. So the fascinating move here is simply this. Luther employs a common term to describe a political reality. His conviction being that when the papacy grabs power for itself in the name of its Christ, you might say, it essentially puts on the mask and the airs of the devil. So Luther takes this popular view and uses it to describe a political reality. And that actually is his interpretation of the book of Revelation. So I'll say a word about that. Luther wrote two prefaces to the New Testament writing of Revelation. One in 1522, the other in 1530. The first in 1522, Luther says, I can't even tell if the Holy Spirit inspired this book. It speaks nothing of the gospel, but in vague visions. And frankly, he says in 1530 that it lends itself to all kinds of crackpot interpretations, which I think is fascinating. And so Luther says in 1530, because of that, we have to set down our interpretation of this book. And so what is Revelation really talking about according to Martin Luther? Well, we hear about two beasts. Clearly, the first beast, says Luther, was the emperor of Rome. And scholars have confirmed this. It's very possible that Revelation was written in two phases. First, under the reign of Nero in the late 60s and early 70s of the first century. Nero, famous for persecuting Christians. And then secondly, under the reign of Domitian, who was also well known for persecuting Christians. So the first beast is most likely the emperor of Rome, who, of course, as you know, demanded worship in the place of the Jewish and Christian God. So that's number one. But of course, Luther says there's a second beast. Luther feels that the papacy has accorded political power to itself. And when it does that, it turns from being the servant of Christ to the sovereign of Christ, and that makes it Antichrist. So that's the first thing that Luther does. The second thing that he does is argue implicitly for the necessity of the devil when it comes to Christian faith, which is astounding. So let's go to that slide now, and then I see a couple questions in the chat field. I'll stop and answer those. Take a look here at this. Quotation number 3. There is no way to grasp Luther's milieu or context or setting of experience and faith unless one has an acute sense of his view of Christian existence between God and the devil. And actually, this is what I really appreciate about Martin Luther. Let me quote Luther and explain. Without a recognition of Satan's power, belief in Christ is reduced to an idea about Christ. and Luther's faith becomes a confused delusion in keeping with the tenor of his time. Luther's new belief in the devil is such an integral part of the Reformation discovery that if the reality of the powers inimical to God is not grasped, the incarnation of Christ, as well as the justification and temptation of the sinner, are reduced to ideas of the mind rather than to experiences of faith. In other words, without talk of the devil, we cannot make sense of the battle, the spiritual battle or struggle that occurs in and through the act of faith, in and through the trusting of God. That is what Luther's battle against the devil was meant to convey. Centuries separate Luther from a modern world, which has renounced, and I love this, and has long since exorcised the devil. Yet he, Luther, unlike any theologian before or after him, was able to disperse the fog of witches' Sabbath and sorcery and show the adversary for what he really was, violent toward God, man, and the world. To make light of the devil is to distort faith. The only way to drive away the devil is through faith in Christ by saying, I have been baptized, I am a Christian. So this talk of the devil for Martin Luther helps us appreciate the spiritual struggle that we find ourselves in when it comes to life before and under God. And that this struggle has real underpinnings in reality. And that the force of evil, the principle of evil, I was going to say Lucifer or Satan, in opposition to God, is the battlefield of spiritual consciousness. Why do I appreciate this? I have long appreciated the struggle of faith that we see in Luther and Kierkegaard. And for Luther, that struggle is made intelligible in our talk about the devil. I want to share with you one other thing about Luther that I find interesting. And then we'll go to your questions. We're doing great on time. So I'll just read this one. It's on Luther and the experience of poltergeists, which takes me to my third point about Luther. I think what Luther's going to show us here in this quotation is that talk of poltergeists and evil spirits can actually be a distraction when it comes to identifying and assessing the true reality of evil in this world. Let me quote Luther and then explain what I mean. The following chronicle of Luther's encounter with the devil. So we know from Luther's testimony that he had encounters with the devil. The famous one occurred when he was in seclusion in the Wartburg Castle in 1522 for 9 to 10 months. He translates the Greek New Testament into German in 11 weeks. That's 27 books, 8,000 verses. 11 weeks, and then writes to his friend Melanchthon, referring to himself as a lazy monk. Standards were pretty high, but it was there that Luther reportedly threw an inkwell at the devil. And if you go to the Wartburg Castle to this day, you can see a big hole in the wall of Luther's room where 17th century Protestant tourists chipped away the ink that was on the wall. Unfortunately, those Protestant tourists didn't read Luther closely. Luther said that he threw ink at the devil, not that he threw an ink well at the devil, which is to say, it's possible Luther was referring to his translation of the New Testament for the German people, which I love, I find fascinating. Either way, Luther's experience of the devil, at least for Luther, is real, but it's different than we might suspect. Listen to the following. Chronicle of his encounter with the devil as a poltergeist with a clearly medieval ring. It is not a unique, unheard of thing for the devil, he writes, to thump about and haunt houses, including Pastor Dan's parsonage close by the Queen Anne. Wait, that's not in here. Sorry, that's a later edition. In our monastery in Wittenberg, I heard the devil distinctly. For when I was to lecture on the book of Psalms, and I was sitting in the refectory after we had sung matins, studying and writing my notes, the devil came and thudded 3 times in the storage chamber, the area behind the stove, as if dragging a bushel away. Finally, as it did not want to stop, I collected my books and went to bed. I collected my books and went to bed. I still regret to this hour that I did not sit with him to discover what else the devil wanted to do. I also heard him once over my chamber in the monastery. Now, what do you notice about this account that's different than, say, The Exorcist or The Conjuring? How does Luther encounter, in this case, a poltergeist? It's like, yeah, I got annoyed, right? And if I had the opportunity to do it again, I might want to know a little more about what the devil was up to and what he wanted. So Luther has this very different way of dealing with the actual experience of poltergeists, and it goes further. He says the final passage with its point, this is the author now, with its pointed formulation and its underlying expression of contempt for the devil was amazing at the time and is overlooked today. And here it is, quote, "But when I realized that it was Satan, I rolled over and went back to sleep again." So what Luther is talking about there is this. It is not as a poltergeist that the devil discloses his true nature. And this, I think, is the most important takeaway. But as the adversary who thwarts the word of God. Not or only then is he really to be feared. He seeks to capture the conscience, can quote the scriptures without fault, and is more pious than God. That is satanical. So what I would argue is that the third thing Luther does, apart from applying the language of the demonic, say, to inappropriate expressions of power in this world, speaking of the devil as a necessity for faith insofar as, and if you would write this part down, if you're taking notes, this is clearer, insofar as it makes the struggle of faith more intelligible. We see this in psychotherapy. I'd have to defer to Betty on this, but when you have some kind of agent or entity that you can battle, it helps with the battle itself. So the idea here is that the devil was of a necessity for Luther when it comes to faith. But then also, I think, talk of poltergeists and the supernatural can actually be a distraction for the real power of evil at work in the world. A power that turns us away from our Christian faith, a power that causes us to go against the teachings of Christ in a variety of ways. That's the real danger. And when it comes to actual poltergeist experiences, Luther just sort of, he gets annoyed, but not scared, because that's not the real power of the devil. And I find that absolutely fascinating. Now, let me pause for just a minute. Are there any questions, observations, comments before we move to the last section of our presentation? Okay, Nancy asks, I have a question about personal strength versus weakness and the presence of evil and demons. How does personal strength against evil enter this? I can't answer that yet. Let's take a look. It's a good question. Let's take a look at what Paul Tillich says about evil and see if that helps us answer the question that you're asking. All right, so the demonic refers to an inner struggle with disruptive forces. That seems to be Luther's understanding. It is more than personal. It is, this is where I want to go next. It can be experienced as physical illness or weakness. It can be experienced as mental illness, but it can also be experienced as a social illness or a collective manifestation. And that's where I think Luther falls short. And that's where I think Paul Tillich, a 20th century Lutheran theologian, is helpful. So let's turn to this, the last section of our discussion for today, and see if we can update the talk of the demonic in the Bible and in Luther from a modern perspective. So we'll go now to our last screen here. All right, so Paul Tillich, it is absolutely impossible, given the amount of time I have and the subject, to even begin to plumb the depths of Tillich's understanding of the demonic. I read his entire essay on this from 1926 yesterday, and it's just fascinating and difficult and hard to make sense of. But I did come away with several things I wanted to share with you that I think are relevant for our conversation. What I would stress is this: Tillich's understanding of the demonic as a German Lutheran theologian changes, as I said at the beginning of our discussion today, changes from before to after the rise of Nazism in Germany. And I'm going to show you how that is. But even before it changes, Tillich made insights that I think were extremely helpful for understanding the demonic from a modern perspective. I want to start by quoting a book by one of Tillich's students named James Luther Adams, who says this. He says, the struggle of genuine religion is directed much more against the anti-divine religion against the demonic. Obviously, this conception of the demonic has nothing to do with the mythical hypostasizing, that means turning into beings or entities, associated with the belief in demons, though it does aim to grasp something suggested by the mythical notion of demons. The demonic is not a tangible entity. Like the terms ground of being, abyss, divine, it is not something that can be identified unambiguously. All of these terms refer to aspects or qualities of human existence. Hence, the demonic is an aspect of power in the structure of our existence. In other words, the demonic is endemic to human being itself. Within us, there is not only a principle of creation and fulfillment of form, there is also a principle of self-destruction. And that is what the demonic is. It is an eruption, Tillich says, from the creative depths of being that disfigures and destroys us. So the demonic requires, for its manifestation, finite forms, human beings to overtake them. It's this principle of destruction that consumes in this case, the human being and destroys it. And what Tillich argues in the first part of this essay is that art concerning the demonic reveals this. So I chose as one example this portrait of, maybe Rich can help me with the pronunciation, but a famous Japanese story about a woman whose ghost, a woman who's been beaten and killed, and whose ghost haunts the perpetrator as a demon. You'll notice when you see this picture here that the face is totally disfigured. And what Tillich points out is that Western art has given expression to this for centuries. That when you see in portraits of the demonic disfigured faces, what we're talking about is a power that is part of nature itself, a kind of form disruptive power that that overtakes us and disfigures us, distorts our humanity. That's Tillich's pre-Nazi understanding of the demonic in history, a power that distorts and disfigures, that erupts, as it were, from the creative depths of being. So what Tillich is doing is he's depersonalizing this language, demythologizing it, talking about how the demonic is a power in history that is part of being itself. The Nazi regime and the Holocaust, of course, changed that, such that for Tillich, the demonic becomes the consequence of idolatry. So when you idolize a person in place of God, the argument is that the demonic enters and destroys. I was thinking of this with regard to January 6th. We may want to talk about this at our coffee hour, but the so-called QAnon shaman, notice the modification, perhaps you might argue the disfigurement. This itself could be an expression of the form disruptive power that enters history and destroys in its wake. That's obviously very controversial, but it might be something worth pursuing. This is what I wanted to summarize when it comes to the transition for Tillich. On the one hand, the demonic seems to be a breakthrough of the divine creativity gone awry. So before the rise of the Nazis, Tillich was talking about how the demonic is in God, you might say, as the creative power in God, but restrained, controlled. In the process of actual creation, that power restrained or controlled in God is, as it were, unleashed, such that in many cases it overtakes the very forms it gives rise to. On the other hand, it seems to be the elevation of the finite to the infinite, so that it is hard to distinguish the demonic from idolatry. And this is where I would conclude to make it easy. All of that language aside, all of that abstract philosophical theological language aside, Tillich ends with this, and I think it could be really helpful for us, and I think it goes all the way back to Martin Luther. The language of the demonic is helpful insofar as it points to the destructive consequences of idolatry, individual or collective, in our lives. With Luther, that idolatry was occurring in Rome. With Tillich, you might say that idolatry was occurring in Berlin. So the demonic refers to the destructive consequences that result from taking something less than divine and elevating it to the divine. It also, I think, points to these subterranean forces that have been relegated to the margins by our Enlightenment scientific way of thinking, that perhaps we need to address the way Luther did. Otherwise, when you leave something not addressed or repressed like that, it comes back potentially with quite a vengeance. So speaking of coming back, let's go to our first screen here, our first question here. I'm going to open it up for the last part of this conversation to our original question. And as I do this, I just want to say what we've tried to do in this short hour is three things. First, sketch a history of the demonic by looking at its Greek origin, and then the influence of post-exilic Jewish literature on the religion of the New Testament, subsequently on Martin Luther, and then its modernization, you might say, in Tillich. That was number one. Number two, identify a third or middle way that acknowledges the reality of evil, which it would be hard to say anything but the Holocaust was evil, and the demonic gives us language for that, acknowledges the reality of this form destructive power in human history, or as a force in history, without literalizing it, without mythologizing it. And then third and finally, my hope was to encourage an in-depth look that we might revisit. So as I was preparing all of this and thinking I have way too much material for 1 hour, unless I just bulldoze through it, which I did today, and I apologize for that. I'd love to turn this into a whole series next year where we really explore the nuances of this issue and really think through the potential relevance of this language for us now in the 21st century. So that was my hope in today's presentation. Here's our preliminary question. Based on our discussion so far in this series, including now today's class, do you find the language of demons, the demonic, evil or evil spirits illuminating or useful? What is your take?
I've found the language of demonic helpful to thinking about social and political issues, but it's not something I talk about very often because I don't want people to think that I'm still living in the Middle Ages.
Right. Yeah, that's the problem, and I think that's the problem we have more broadly in progressive mainline Protestant churches, is that we don't want to come off as weirdos or people who live in the past. We are people who are modern, where we affirm science, we see ourselves as rational, and so to use this kind of language seems to bring with it the risk that will be viewed in a way that we really don't desire. So yeah, that's a challenge for us. And yet what's interesting is that this series has garnered more interest than virtually any other series, with the exception of our discussions on the environment, which we'll come back to later in the spring, than virtually any other series we've had in the last year or two. So it seems to me that there is a desire to talk about this, but at the same time, there is also this hesitancy for the very reason, Bob, that you gave. So I appreciate your point there. And I would really lift up as well your point about the use of the demonic to talk about not mental illness or physical illness, but social illness. Is there a way? And the reason I don't want to use it for mental illness is that I think folks who have these mental illnesses are already stigmatized enough in this culture. We don't need to add to that by talking about it in terms of the demonic. But I think when it comes to social illness, collective manifestations of the demonic might be a helpful way to begin to kind of turn up what's going on there and look at it more closely. So, I have to say, Betty, I already mentioned you, but seeing you on the screen is really helpful for me because I'm reminded we have a psychologist among us. And so I think that distinction is so crucial about not wanting to stigmatize people who are already suffering from mental illness, but at the same time, to the best of our ability, to preserve this language so that we can perhaps talk about collective manifestations of illness. And I firmly believe, and I'll say this unapologetically, that I believe we are in a period of American history where we are confronting the demonic in our culture. And I have no bones about saying that the QAnon shaman, from my perspective, was an expression of the demonic on January 6th. That there was a form disruptive power here, that in the name of a less than absolute absolute, to bring harm onto other people, destroy, and to undermine the democratic process. There is not a better word for that in Christian vocabulary than the demonic, in my opinion.
Pastor, I'd like a clarification. Yeah. In a lot of things that we talk about today, we use the term systemic, like systemic racism, that sort of thing. How does that compare with when we use the term demonic?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've been thinking a lot about that too, and I won't put it off by saying I'd like to explore that further in a series devoted to this topic, but I really would. I think that you might be able to argue that the demonic would be the form destructive eruptions that result from systemic inequalities.
So you're saying it's more of the demonic is a response to systemic.
Yeah, or an expression of it. Yeah, maybe, an expression of it or a symptom of it. It's hard to say because I think of it, then if I think of symptom, well, wait a second, couldn't I argue also that the inequality is the result of the demonic working in history? But I guess what I want to say is that when we're talking about the demonic, we're really talking as well about this. That's why I love Tillich's use of art. We're really talking about something that disfigures, distorts, and destroys a kind of power or force operative in history, all the way up through human personality that destroys us. So I would say the two are related. I would say that our analysis of systemic injustice is one thing. The actual demonic manifestation of that comes about when we see evidence of destruction and so forth. So that's the best I can do. The shorter answer for me would have been just to say, I don't know. I see that as a problem and a challenge, and I'd like to think it through further for myself as well. Others? I guess I should have said my real goal for today was to make you a little less afraid of poltergeist experiences. I'm curious what your thoughts were on Martin Luther and his response to the devil banging on the above the stove. Yeah,
Pastor
Nancy?
Dan.
Oh, I see. Yeah, so who's that?
Pastor Dan, this is Michael Buller calling here
Hi,
from
Michael,
North
let me
Dakota.
come to you
How are-
1 second. All right, I saw Nancy first, and I'll just come right back to you, okay?
Sounds great. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, Nancy, go ahead.
Yeah, I was quite interested in the Catholic priest and what he talked about discernment and how I think this is an important topic to study. I'm talking about demons and darkness and so forth, because when we come to church, you know, we come to love everyone, to learn about Jesus, to love our neighbor. You know, we're taught all the positive things in our worship. That's what we do. So how do we see the evil then? You know, the priest talked about discernment. And I think when you were talking about Martin Luther, that's what I was thinking about, was maybe he's just discerning. He can see it, but he's not going to allow it to take him over.
Yeah, that's such a great point, and there is a parallel here. One, I believe if we were to talk about discernment extensively as a way to deal with the demonic and the temptations and so forth of the demonic, Luther's the fact that Luther ignores it, I think, is one example of using a particular technique in discernment when it comes to the temptations, for example, brought about by the demonic. It's interesting, though, because Luther isn't always presented as one who simply ignores. Well, maybe so. I guess I would just want to say that in Luther's response to the devil, the way you're talking about it, that could be a discernment technique, and it'd be worth exploring. I was thinking about this not only with regard to the Jesuit tradition, but also with regard to a book that some of us read a couple years ago called The Cloud of Unknowing. That author gives techniques for dealing with, you might say, if not the daimon, the daimonic. All I can say in response to your point is that was my favorite part of Father Watson's presentation, and I think it deserves a lot more attention. It would be really interesting for us, I think, to recover for Protestants, for Lutherans, a kind of discernment process that we see flourish in the Catholic Jesuit tradition. And I think that's the real contribution. I may not agree with Father Watson about the reality of these entities metaphysically, but I would argue, and there are plenty of Jesuits who will say this, that these are forces inimical to the fullness of life. And that as people who engage in the process of discernment, the task of which is to distinguish these forces, these voices, from the voice of God calling us to fuller life. One of the Jesuits that I worked with liked to quote, I think it was Irenaeus, who said that the glory of God is the human being fully alive. And he would say, follow that. Follow that. That's discernment, right? So I think for us to move forward in our own spirituality, it'd be great to draw what we can from the Jesuit tradition. And I'll be working with Father Watson on that very possibility in the next 6 months. So more to come. I'm glad you raised that point. Michael, yes.
So Pastor Dan, very good discussion. You've definitely covered quite a bit in a very short period of time. Want to go back to Paul Tillich for just a minute with the pre-Nazi, post-Nazi. So when he was pre-Nazi, the depersonalized interpretation of the Spirit made me think of the movie Passion. So the Passion that came out a few years ago, Mel Gibson's interpretation of how Jesus died. There's a particular scene where Peter is looking at the faces of children, and the faces of the children are distorted and disrupted by the demonic presence. I just thought that was very interesting. I just saw a corollary there. But my question, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Mel Gibson sees himself as a good Catholic, right? And so he has a lot of, I would assume, familiarity, exposure to the artwork that goes along with the demonic. And I think the observation you're making there is great. And I also appreciate what you said, because I want to highlight it for the rest of the group. It's not that Tillich was a Nazi. He was never a Nazi. But his view of the demonic changed after the Nazis rose to power. Tillich says in an interview he gave to Time magazine in the late 1950s that he had the honor of being the first non-Jew dismissed from a German university by the Nazis. So he was opposed to that regime from the beginning. But because of what he witnessed in Nazi Germany up through 1933, including the burning of his own books, was an experience that would subsequently inform his view of the demonic. So anyway, Michael, back to you.
Yeah, so my question is, there's an evolution that takes place, and because of his experiences that you just pointed out, and being exiled at such an older age and having to learn English around 48 years old as he moved to the United States, but he went from this depersonalized understanding of the demonic to a more personalized interpretation where, you know, it was a consequence of idolatry is what he actually moved towards. I'm just wondering if this depersonalized view is still very prevalent in current theology and could very well be the reason why there's such a disconnect between more liberalized theology versus more evangelical conservative theology.
So when you say depersonalized, are you talking about the understanding of the demonic as a kind of disruptive force in history rather than a personal experience of a poltergeist?
Well, yeah, I guess so. The depersonalized kind of rang some bells for me in the sense that it's not working within me. Rather, it's these forces that are around me. So it could be objects or it could be people that are distorted and also disrupted, and then through some type of schism, I could be exercised and be fixed. But it really, it kind of removes you from being any of the cause of it. While the more personalized is concentrate, puts the onus on the individual and that which they decide to put in that very coveted space of being God.
Right. Yeah. So Go ahead, please.
So back to the question, which is just that with this evolution, I'm wondering if that's maybe part of the disconnect between more liberalized theology versus the more conservative evangelical theology currently in our modern day era right now. This disconnect between personalized versus depersonalized. It's me, it's not me type thing.
Oh, I see. Whereas, are you saying that a more progressive or liberal view is that you take responsibility for it, and a more conservative view is that the devil made you do it? Is that the distinction that you're drawing? I
guess. Yeah, I would be looking more at it from the sense of depersonalized, in the sense that I'm faithful, but everyone else around me potentially could be possessed. Where Tillich's view more evolved into the sense of that all of us fall short.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that. I get nervous with those big categories of. I mean, I see what you're trying to do. I get a little nervous talking about the conservative and the liberal here because, in part, I mean, there are plenty of conservative theologies that do talk about the collective manifestation of the demonic. I mean, the power of darkness. I remember when I was in Minnesota 20 years ago, there was a book going around, really popular about that. This Present Darkness is what it was called. So I get a little nervous about making hard and fast distinctions. Shoot me an email or send me a text, and let's see if we can figure this one out. Because I'm not following you yet, but I know there's something there. I know you well enough to know there's definitely something there. Okay?
No, that's good stuff. So thanks for sharing it. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and thank you all for having the patience to sit through a forum where mostly it's the speaker talking. I like conversation more, so if you are able to join us for our coffee hour in about 15 minutes, we'd absolutely welcome you there. Otherwise, thank you so much for your attention this morning. We covered a lot of material. If this subject interests you further, please send me or Carolyn Davis an email and let us know, and we'd be happy to consider it for the year to come. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and we'll see you soon. Don't forget, God for Grownups features last week's podcast as a podcast recording with Father William Watson, and the video, again, thanks to Todd Bishop today, will be available, this video, on our YouTube channel. So don't forget to visit those and subscribe. Thanks so much. Take care.